What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be making part 2 of our 3-part series here, and it's going over all the changes I would make if I had control of the Druid class for Season 3. Now, just in case you don't know, this is entirely my own opinion. There is nothing I know about Diablo 4 Season 3 that you don't already know, and I am patiently waiting for the campfire chats and the official patch notes, just like everyone else currently is. However, I thought this would be a really fun video series to make just to generate some cool conversation around the Druid class and all the different things that people might think would be great ideas for the class as a whole. So with that being said, go ahead and leave your ideas down in the comments section of this video and let me know if you agree with some of the things I've mentioned in this video or if you disagree. But now that we got that out of the way, I just wanted to list the 4 things that I think would be great changes to make for all the classes in Diablo 4 for Season 3. Now again, all of these have been listed in the very first video, but I did want to go back over them in each video just so that way as many people could give me their input as possible. So for the very first change I would make for Season 3 is that I would add movement speed into the leveling process. And that would probably be something along the lines of a 0.5% increase to movement speed per level the character gains up to level 100, and that would finish out at roughly 150% movement speed at level 100, and I thought that would be a really great change to make the leveling process that much better for all the classes across the board. Now, the next thing I wanted to add in would be adding iframes to the dodge roll. I thought this would be a really cool way to increase the skill ceiling for Diablo 4 and really give a lot of players an opportunity to outplay some of the one-shot mechanics that exist in the game. Another great change I had thought of was adding resource generation across the board to all classes, including druids and barbarians, as I think this would be a welcome change to really help make the early game leveling process that much better for all classes across the board. And then lastly, I thought it would be a pretty decent idea to remove the arbitrary lucky hit values from all the skills and just give it maybe a base 10% chance to lucky hit for each class, and then you would scale that additively just like you would do crit chance through your gear pieces. And then I wanted to go ahead and give 2 more bonus ideas here. And the first one would be to make the electrified obelisks that spawn from certain monster modifications attackable by the player. So currently in the game, electrified obelisks seem to be a bit overtuned, and I think if we were just allowed to attack and destroy them when they spawn, it would make that monster mechanic that much better, and honestly something I think a lot of players would prefer. And lastly, I think it would be a great idea to put suppressor enemies on a rotating cooldown. So say something like giving them a 2 to 3 second duration for their suppressor dome, and then it goes on a cooldown for 2 to 3 seconds, and then they have it back up for 2 to 3 seconds, and it just rotates continuously until that specific monster's killed. I think that would be a pretty welcome addition to the game because currently there really is no other way to outplay that monster type except for jumping headlong into that suppressor dome, and sometimes that can spell certain doom for the player without really any chance to outplay the mechanic. But now that we've gotten all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about the glyphs first. Now, while I'm going over these glyphs, guys, do realize that I am a player who believes that player power has gotten way out of control in Season 2, and that in Season 3 there really needs to be a massive pullback if we hope to ever have any meaningful endgame in Diablo 4. As it currently stands, there are just way too many sources of multiplicative damage throughout our Paragon Board glyphs, as well as our legendary nodes and aspects. So I will say that my hope is that in Season 3, they really pull back a lot of the power they've given us in Season 2 and really work on balancing the game and creating more meaningful engagements for the player base overall. So that way, when you finally defeat that uber boss or you finally complete that tier 100 dungeon, it feels like a legitimate accomplishment and not something that's basically just a given because you're doing hundreds of millions, if not billions of damage. So the first thing I'd want them to do on the development side is to make sure that all of the damage bonuses you're getting from your glyphs are actually applying across the board properly to all your skills. Now, starting off with Bane here, I actually think Bane is a really cool glyph. However, I think the problem truly lies in how dots currently function in Diablo 4. So if it was my choice, I would actually change how poison functions. I would, instead of scaling it off of base damage, I would scale it off of your total damage, and then I would obviously bring that percentage very far down, so that way it wouldn't be overpowered. And then instead of scaling the poison damage infinitely off of the same source, I would only allow the poisons to stack a single time from different sources. So what that would probably look like from the player perspective is if you used Claw, you would poison the enemy with Claw's poison damage. And then if you use Shred, that would stack on top of Claw's damage, but be a separate scaling dot. And then say you use something like Rabies, that would also stack on top of the previously two mentioned skills, again, scaling off of its skill value. And I feel like that would give an opportunity to really scale dots appropriately so that players could make really cool dot builds that don't necessarily function off of a separate mechanic to apply a larger amount of damage. Now for Dominate, this is our overpower glyph on the Druid, and honestly, I really can't determine if this needs to be adjusted because, well, overpowered is overpowered currently. So until they actually bring that mechanic down and make it more appropriate for the game, I really can't make a determination on Dominate. For Earth and Sky, I really enjoy all of these glyphs that give you a bonus to your magic or rare nodes. I think it's a really cool way to add some creativity to your builds. However, for these additional bonuses, I would definitely scale these multiplicative damage bonuses down to probably something around 5%. Because, like I said in the beginning, I feel like player power is out of control and we're getting way too much multiplicative damage in our builds. So for Electrocution, again, I really like this glyph. I think it works really well, and I like the idea that it scales your lightning bolts and your dancing bolts. However, again, that 20% multiplicative damage increase is insanely powerful, and it makes this almost a must-have for pretty much a lot of the different builds that exist for the Druid. And I think they should definitely rework that multiplicative damage bonus again, probably not exceeding anything above 5% multiplicative damage. Now for Exploit, I think glyphs that give additive damage are perfectly fine. I don't think those need to be brought down whatsoever. Now for the additional bonus here, I like the idea that it's giving you another source to apply vulnerability to enemies. However, this 20-second cooldown is insane, and again, something that they need to adjust because vulnerability is no longer as powerful as it once was. So they need to go back and adjust some of these figures. I would probably bring that down to something along the lines of maybe 5 seconds, so that way you could keep vulnerability up on enemies more consistently. Then for Fang Claw, again, I love the bonus, but I would bring the additional bonus multiplicative damage down to 5% or less. Fulminate, same thing. I think this is a decent glyph as well. However, I would ask them to, again, go back and make sure that it's applying its damage across the board to all skills that utilize lightning damage. And then for its additional bonus, I actually think it's not too bad being 12%. I might bring it down to something like 10% because it only works off of healthy and injured enemies, and that really makes it a lot less powerful than a lot of these glyphs who are applying multiplicative damage across the board. Now for Guzzler, I'm perfectly fine with the standard bonus on it. However, for the additional bonus, I would probably make it something like increased damage reduction while healthy, or maybe give you some HP regen as your additional bonus, just some way of adding some tankiness to your class. Now for Human, I wouldn't change this whatsoever. I wouldn't really change Human, I wouldn't change Werewolf, and I wouldn't change Werebear. I like the additive damage, and I like the fact that they have damage reduction as their additional bonus. But again, like I said, I would just want the developers to make sure that these damage bonuses are applying across the board to everything. Now for Keeper, I would only apply that multiplicative damage bonus to your companions, and I would probably scale it up to something around 15 to 20%. And I know this goes against what I previously said, but in my last video I stated for Season 3, I would make companions completely overpowered, and then I would probably sometime in the early season go ahead and reduce that power some, just because as it currently stands, companions are pretty much useless across the board. Then for Outmatch, I would go ahead and scale that multiplicative damage down, and I would apply that bonus across the board to all enemy types. Now let's talk about Poise here. So the overall glyph, like I said, I'm fine with the bonus, but this additional bonus is where I start to get frustrated with the developers. This one reads out, you have a 30% chance when shapeshifting to gain a barrier that absorbs 5% of your maximum life and damage for 4 seconds. And that to me just makes no sense. I don't know how you could write something like that down and actually put it into the game. And for me, I personally would change it to read something like, you have a 30% chance when taking damage while shapeshifted to gain a barrier that absorbs 25% of your maximum life for 4 seconds. And I think that would actually change this glyph to be much more valuable to the player, so it might actually be a choice for you. But as it currently stands, stuff like this really has to go. I think they really need to kind of read over these bonuses or read over a lot of the things that they put in the game and really determine if they make much sense. Because I don't know, like I said, I don't know how you could read that and actually put it in the game. Then on to Protector. I'm perfectly fine with this glyph. Again, I would just make sure that is applying the additional bonus appropriately. Now for Shapeshifter, I would probably change the additional bonus to give you a flat amount of crit chance, probably something along the lines of 5 to 10% crit chance while shapeshifted. And I think giving players more areas to acquire crit chance would definitely help soften the blow of reducing a lot of these multiplicative damage bonuses. Now for Spirit, I would change the additional bonus to, instead of giving you a multiplicative damage stack, I would give you an additive crit chance stack, probably something along the lines of 2% up to 10%. Then for Tectonic, again, really like this glyph, and I think if we made those lucky hit changes that I mentioned at the beginning of this video, that 15% chance would be a big bonus, and that would make this glyph even better for a lot of different builds. Then for Territorial, I have no problem with this. You get some additive damage and you get some damage reduction. I think this is a pretty decent glyph overall. Then for Tracker, again, I think this would be a really great glyph. All they need to do is change how poison damage is applied to enemies, and I think that would make a lot of the dot builds that much better. I wouldn't really change Undaunted. Again, I would just make sure it's functioning correctly. And like I said earlier, Werebear and Werewolf I would leave the same. I would just, again, make sure that the damage bonuses are applying correctly. And then last but not least for Wilds, I would go ahead and remove this additional bonus. I would make the bonus scale companion damage instead of just companion skill damage. And then for the additional bonus of this glyph, I think I would go ahead and let this glyph give the player a +1 or +2 additional companions per companion skill. So that way you could have more wolves, more poison creepers, and more ravens. So I just think that would be a really great idea to make this glyph a go-to for creating a true companion build for the Druid class. And now that we've tackled all of the glyphs, let's go ahead and talk about the Paragon Boards and the legendary nodes. Now onto our Paragon Boards. I think stats are in a phenomenal place right now, and I honestly would not change them or how they scale. I think when you get your stat points, whether it be strength, dexterity, intelligence, or willpower, they definitely add a meaningful difference to your character. I also feel the same way about magic nodes and rare nodes. I think this gives an opportunity to add some survivability and damage to the player without really overpowering the player. However, I will say that they are a bit lackluster in terms of creativity, so hopefully sometime in the future they might just take this entire system out and add something to really kind of inspire people to make some really creative builds. But until that happens, I think they're perfectly fine where they are. Now, that doesn't mean I wouldn't change anything. So for the very first change I would make is I would change these magic nodes that give stats to +10 instead of +7. I have no idea who chose 7. I don't know why they chose 7. Maybe they just really love that number. Maybe it's their lucky number. Maybe they just don't like double-digit number. I have no idea. But 7 is a terrible idea. It doesn't give you the opportunity to free up any of your Paragon points. So if you just change it to +10, it would really allow players to fine-tune their builds a little bit more. And honestly, it just makes a lot more sense to make it +10. Now for the very first Paragon board, that is our Ancestral Guidance board, and the first thing I would do here for the Legendary node is, instead of this being a multiplicative damage bonus that occurs after spending a certain amount of Spirit, I would make this a multiplicative damage bonus that scales based off of your maximum Spirit, and it only affects your core skills. And I think this would be a much better Legendary node, because then it wouldn't actually penalize you for going after that Spirit cost reduction in your builds. Then the next thing I would do is I would change Recuperate to just give you a flat HP regen bonus instead of this while not damaged, because it makes it pretty much useless. And then I would also change this increase to your potion healing and instead make it something like giving your potion a heal over time, so that way it actually gives you some value and increases your survivability, because as it currently stands, there's really no reason to pick this. So I think giving your potion a heal over time value and then also giving you some flat HP regen would make this node a lot more better. And then obviously I would change the magic nodes around it to fit the rare node as well. Then to the Reclamation node, I would definitely change this to give you a much larger maximum Spirit increase. And then I would also change that to Spirit on kill to give you just a flat amount of Spirit regeneration. And then again, change the magic nodes accordingly. Then for the Natural Attunement node, again, just increase that maximum Spirit amount significantly there. Then for Resolve, I wouldn't change it at all. Now that they've made resistances better, more meaningful, I think this is a perfect node. Then for Harmony, more additive core skill damage is good. I don't think I'd change this one at all either. Then for the spiritual power node, I would probably remove this basic skill damage, even though I do think I would want an entire Paragon board dedicated to just increasing your basic skill damage. As it currently stands, I find this to be completely useless. So I would remove this basic skill damage as well as all of the accompanying magic nodes and probably make this something that gives you critical strike damage to your core skills, just to keep the theme of this overall Paragon board in line with the legendary node. Now on to the Constricting Tendrils board. I honestly love this board and I really wouldn't change too much about it. The only thing I would probably change is the legendary node, and that is because it's absolutely terrible. So what I would do is, because this functions off of a lucky hit, I would change this percentage chance from 15 to probably somewhere along the lines of 40 to 50% chance to proc, as Immobilize isn't really that strong of a CC. You can still be attacked by all the monsters while they're immobilized, so I don't know why it has to be that low. And then again, if we just adjusted how poison damage is actually applied to enemies, I think this would be much more valuable. However, in my opinion, what I would really like to do here is remove that poison damage and just give the player another source of multiplicative damage, because we've taken so many away. So that way it really adds some value to this legendary node. And then lastly, I would give this node a way to apply this debuff to bosses without actually applying the CC, because obviously if you could apply the CC to bosses, it would be far too overpowered. But a lot of the problems with a lot of these different damage sources that require CC is that they don't function on bosses. So I really think the developers need to understand that in order to make a really valuable legendary node something that's worth going after and wasting a lot of points to get to, it needs to be something that can be applied across the board in all aspects of the game. And it needs to be something that fundamentally changes the character in some way, in a meaningful way. You need to see a marked increase to your damage, or you need to see a marked increase to your survivability. So that's exactly what I would probably do with this legendary node. And like I said, I love the board overall. So other than that, I really wouldn't change it too much. Oh, and again, change the magic stat nodes from being +7 to +10. Doesn't make any sense why they're +7. Now onto the Earth and Devastation board, and I actually think this is one of the better designed legendary nodes in the Druid class, and I really enjoy this legendary node. I think that it's really cool that it gives you a crit damage multiplier, and they've rescaled crit damage in Season 2, so it's not quite overtuned like it was in Season 1, and you definitely feel the effects of this legendary node, but it doesn't make your character overpowered. So I really like this legendary node, and I'd like to see more nodes kind of adjusted to something like this that doesn't necessarily give you a flat multiplicative damage bonus, but is a multiplier from some of your other damage buckets. Then for the Crushing Earth rare node, I would change the critical strike damage to crowd control enemies to just critical strike damage to your Earth skills. Then for Earth and Power, I would change the critical strike damage with Earth skills to just Earth skill damage. Then again, for the Slayer node, change that increase to potion healing to be a heal over time for your potion. I like Resolve again. The way they've changed resistances really makes this meaningful. I think Suffused Resilience is fine, especially now that they've kind of corrected some of the damage over time effects from your Nightmare dungeons. And then, last but not least, I would change the second bonus here on the Oppress node. So instead of it giving you critical strike damage to crowd control enemies, it would just give your Earth skills more critical strike damage. But overall, I'm pretty happy with the Earth and Devastation board, and I really like this legendary node. Now on to the Height and Malice board, and this is one of the more popular boards for the Druid class. And the first thing I would do here with the legendary node is I would definitely drop that multiplicative damage bonus to around 15%. Then I would allow that 15% multiplicative damage bonus to apply to your damage over time effects with your poisons. And then lastly, I would allow this legendary node to function while you're fighting bosses continuously. So you're always getting that multiplicative damage bonus while you're fighting bosses. And I think I like the 3 or more poison enemies nearby for when you're doing Nightmare dungeons. I think that's a cool, unique way to apply this buff to your character while you're doing dungeons. And then just allowing this multiplier to function with your damage over time effects, and then also to be applied to bosses continuously would really make this legendary node stand out and make it a worthwhile legendary node to acquire while you're building out your character. Then for Poison Resilience, I would probably leave this like it is. However, if you did want to change it, I would probably change that flat poison resistance to instead give you a damage reduction from damage over time effects. And I think that might make this rare node a lot more valuable. Then for Overturn, I'd probably leave this like it is. I think it's pretty decent. Damage to poison enemies, damage to elite enemies. It's a pretty decent rare node and has some pretty decent magic nodes. Then for Toxic Bane, because we have so many sources of damage to poison enemies, I would probably flip those bonuses to give you a bigger damage bonus to your poison damage and then give you a smaller damage bonus to damage to poison enemies. Then for the Poison Condition rare node, I would probably change this Poison Resistance to give you damage reduction from poisoned enemies, because you really only have one source of that in this board, and that typically is much more valuable overall for your character. Then for Nature's Born, it's perfectly fine. And for Sinking Fangs, I'd probably leave this one just like it is as well. Now on to the Inner Beast board. So for this legendary node, I would change it pretty significantly. So it currently reads out, after shapeshifting, your spirit costs are reduced by 10% for 5 seconds up to 30%. Instead, I would have this say, while shapeshifted, your spirit costs are reduced by 10% every 5 seconds up to a maximum of 30%. And that should really make that spirit cost reduction much more consistent. And you would definitely feel this legendary node would be quite beneficial when you equipped it when you're using a shapeshifting build. Then on to the Havoc rare node. I have no idea why they just casually threw in physical damage here. I would just change that to damage while shapeshifted. I think the Slayer node's perfectly fine here. Now, with these attack speed buff nodes, this Nimble node here, I would significantly buff this attack speed. So I would say 7% attack speed, and the bonus would be another 7%. So you'd end up with 14% attack speed. And then for these magic nodes, these would all be 2%. So if you decided to invest the amount of points required to acquire this rare node as well as all the magic nodes, you would end up with a pretty hefty attack speed buff of 20%. And I think it would make this much more valuable for the player. Then for the rare node Shapeshifter, again, just change this from shapeshifting skill damage to while shapeshifted. Then for Determination, I'm perfectly fine with more armor. It's a great damage reduction source. And then Tenacity is good as well, gives you more life and more armor, and those are both really valuable. So now for the Lust for Carnage board, and this is something that's really puzzled me for the werewolf form since I started playing the Druid class, and that's this kind of focus on, you know, spirit regeneration and spirit cost reduction from some of the different aspects of the werewolf form. So to me, the usual difference between werebear and werewolf is attack damage and damage reduction versus attack speed and movement speed. And I think they should really kind of stick to that theme for werewolf. So in my opinion, for this legendary node, I would change it to give the werewolf form a damage multiplier. Say like something like 10% multiplicative damage while in werewolf form, and then I would have that scale 2% up to a maximum of 20% multiplicative damage based off your current attack speed values. And I think that would make this legendary node really stand out for the werewolf, giving you that source of multiplicative damage, but also giving you a reason to stack out more attack speed. Then for the fleeting rare node here, I would go ahead and keep the damage taken over time reduction. However, I would remove the controlled impaired duration reduction completely and instead replace it with a percentage increase to your movement speed, and then I would change all of the magic nodes to match that. So that way you would just give the player more options to acquire movement speed without investing in your gear affixes. Then for Furocity, I have no problem with this board being dedicated to werewolf skills, so I would go ahead and keep this as it currently is. For Recuperate, again, just flat HP regen here, and then also giving your potion the ability to give you a heal over time effect off of this bonus will be much more beneficial to the player overall. Then for Wild's Call, again, I would just dramatically increase that attack speed buff to probably 7% like the previous one, and then I would give that bonus another 7%, and then I would increase all the magic nodes around it to give you 2%, so that way if you wanted to invest all the points, it would be a nice 20% increase to your attack speed. And then, of course, that maximum spirit value needs to go up significantly, as well as all of the magic nodes for the maximum spirit. Then for Regenerative, I would be perfectly fine with that staying the +4 healing received, as long as that healing received applied to all of the HP regen changes I would have made if I had control of the Druid class. And then again, for Feral, I'm perfectly fine with that staying werewolf skill damage. Now on to the werebear version of Lust for Carnage, Survival Instincts. And for this legendary node, again, I really think it should just be much more simple and should be something that you can calculate more consistently. So instead of this giving you a multiplicative damage bonus based off of the difference between your health and the enemy's health, I would probably make this a flat 10% multiplicative damage bonus that scales to a total of 20% multiplicative damage based off of your current overpower damage bonus. And then, of course, reworking overpower to make more sense for the current state of the core game. Then for the Earth Sign node here, I think it's perfectly fine giving you damage to werebear skills, just like I didn't mind it in Lust for Carnage. And the overpower damage, again, just reworking that mechanic so it's not so overtuned. I really don't know exactly what the best value would be until they do something like that. Then for Bulwark, I'm fine with it giving you a damage reduction while fortified, but I would probably change that fortified generation to be like elemental resistance just to make it a little bit more valuable for the player if they decided to go after this node. Then for Spearhead, I wouldn't change this at all. I think it's decent. Gives you a big chunk of damage towards healthy enemies as well as some armor. Then for Zealous, I like the damage value here. However, I might go ahead and swap out that armor value for an overpower value, but again, they would have to just rework overpower so it's not so overtuned. Then for Grizzly, you could probably change the damage while in werebear form to just damage with werebear skills, but honestly, it could just stay like it is. Then for Battle Worn Hide, I would probably go ahead and increase that total armor value to something like 4 or 5% total armor while in werebear form, just so that way when you picked up that node, you really seen a significant increase to your total armor. Last but not least, we have the Thunderstruck board in our legendary node Thunderstruck, and this is one of the best legendary nodes that we currently have in our boards, and that's because it gives us a huge multiplicative damage bonus to our storm skills, and that also scales off of our damage versus close and damage versus distant enemy bonuses, and it doesn't even have a cap. So I know you guys probably aren't going to like this again, but I believe in order for us to have a meaningful end game, we really have to kind of pull back on our player power. So for me, this legendary node would probably function similar to the Earth and Devastation node, except that the multiplier would apply to the vulnerable damage bucket, and then I would still go ahead and allow it to scale off of damage versus close and damage versus distant enemy bonuses. And I probably would still allow it to be uncapped just in case you wanted to go ahead and go full force into those specific damage affixes on your gear just to continue to pump up that multiplier to your vulnerable damage. And I think it would still be a very meaningful legendary node for the player to acquire to increase their damage overall, and you would probably still feel a significant boost from it. But I think giving us this massive multiplier is just a bit too powerful in my opinion. And like I said, just pull back on the player power, because if not, we're just going to keep one-shotting everything, killing all the bosses with no problem, killing all the in-game content with no problem, and we'll never get any sense of a meaningful, fulfilling end-game. But then again, that is just my opinion on the matter, and that might not be the broad opinion shared by many players. Then for Tempest, I would go ahead and change this critical strike damage to storm skill damage. Restorative, like I said, just change that potion healing to something that gives your potion a heal over time. It might make it more valuable for players. Then for Lightning Resilience, again, I don't really see a reason to pick up these random resistance bonuses when all resists are just so good. So I would probably go ahead and change this to some form of all resist, just so that way it might be valuable to the player to pick up. Then for Deluge, go ahead and change that critical strike damage to damage towards vulnerable enemies. And then I'm perfectly fine with the Stormcaller rare node. And I think damage reduction from vulnerable enemies is perfectly fine as well. But that's really it for the video, guys. Those are all the changes I would make to the Paragon boards and the Glyphs if I had control of the Druid in Season 3. Like I said, I really believe we need to pull back on player power so we can have a meaningful end game. Either that or the devs really need to increase the overall health pools of everything in the game and add some invulnerability segments to bosses so that way we actually have to engage with their mechanics. But anyways, let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Do you like some of my ideas? What are some of your ideas that you would like to see on the Druid with regards to the Paragon board and the Glyphs for Season 3? But as always, I hope you guys are having a great day or a great night wherever you're from, and peace out, guys. I will see you in the next one.